There is a place where everything feels paused. Not failed, not moving, just not yet. And the question, is it working yet, isn't curiosity. It's the voice of that place. Not out loud, not in a comment. Inside, quietly, almost automatically. You're doing your affirmations and then your mind leans forward. You're trying to stay calm and then your body tightens. You're living as if, and then something in you asks for an update. Is it working yet? And you can feel what happens the moment that question appears. A slight pressure in the chest, a rush in the stomach, a small urgency that says, check. Check the account, check the messages, check the signs, check the calendar. It feels like curiosity, but it isn't, because real awareness doesn't beg for confirmation. Real assumption doesn't keep looking over its shoulder. That question is not coming from power. It's coming from the version of you that is still waiting. And the moment you ask it, you return to that identity, even if only for a second. That question doesn't come from awareness, it comes from waiting. This video is not here to give you another technique. It's not going to teach you how to affirm harder, visualize longer, or manifest faster, because speed is not the problem. Resetting is. Every time that question shows up, is it working yet? Something quietly collapses. Not the desire, the state. And most people never see that's what's happening. So the purpose of this video is very specific. It's to give you relief, not by adding more to do, but by removing the one habit that keeps undoing everything. You're going to understand why that question destabilizes the state, even when you know the law, even when you've seen proof before. And more importantly, you'll know exactly what to do in the moment it appears, not later, not after you calm down, right then. So instead of fighting the question, instead of answering it, suppressing it, or reinforcing around it, you'll finally step out of the identity that asks it. By the end, you'll recognize the not yet state the moment you enter it, and you'll know how to leave without force. The mistake is not asking the question. The mistake is living from the place that asks it. The not yet state doesn't feel wrong. It feels responsible. When you ask, is it working yet? You're not gathering information. You're revealing a position. Under the surface, the question is already answering itself. It's saying, I'm not there yet. I'm still waiting. I need reassurance. And those aren't thoughts, they're identities. This is the part most people miss. Questions are not innocent. Questions are states in motion. Every question comes from a location in consciousness. And this question only comes from one place. The place of someone who believes the end is still ahead of them. You don't ask, is it working yet, when something feels settled. You don't ask it when something feels normal. You don't ask it when you're living from the end. You ask it when part of you is still watching the distance. And the moment you ask, something subtle happens. You step out of assumption and back into evaluation. You stop being the one who has and become the one who checks. The most dangerous part of not yet is that it feels like progress. You're thinking, monitoring, adjusting, but you're no longer standing where things move. Even if everything felt calm 5 minutes earlier, that single question quietly resets the position. Not because you did something wrong, not because you lack faith, but because consciousness is precise. It doesn't respond to what you hope, it responds to where you're standing. And every time you ask that question, you step back into not yet. That's the error. There's a simple mechanism underneath all of this, and once you see it, the pattern becomes obvious. Everything moves in this order. State, identity, perception. Your state is the position you're living from. Your identity is who you experience yourself as inside that state. And perception is how the world shows up in response. When the state is assumed, identity feels settled. When identity is settled, perception relaxes. This is how it usually goes at first. You assume the end. There's a lightness, a quiet relief. For a moment, you stop checking, and then, almost automatically, the mind leans forward. Is it working? Right there, the mechanism flips. The question doesn't destroy anything. It doesn't cancel your desire. It doesn't undo the law. It simply moves you. You shift from being to watching, from living as the one who has to observing as the one who waits. And with that shift, identity changes. You're no longer the person for whom this is normal. You're the person monitoring progress. So perception follows. You start scanning again, looking for signs, measuring time, noticing absence. The cycle looks like this. You assume. You feel lighter. You ask, is it working? You return to the self who waits. And then people blame themselves. They think they lacked discipline or faith or consistency. But nothing went wrong. This is not punishment. It's precision. The law doesn't respond to hope. It responds to position. Hope still leans forward. Position stands. The moment you ask that question, you don't get punished. You simply relocate yourself from certainty back to expectancy. And expectancy always experiences delay, not because the desire moved away, but because the identity moved back. Once you see this, the question loses its power, because you realize it was never about timing. It was about where you were standing the moment you asked. Neville used the word state in a very grounded way, even though people often turn it into something mystical. A state is not a feeling you try to create. It's not an emotion you maintain. And it's not a mood you perform. A state is simply where you live from when you're not trying. It's who you are being in the quiet moments, when no one is watching, when you're not affirming, visualizing, or correcting your thoughts. That's the state. This is where expectation comes in. There is a calm expectation, and there is an anxious one. Calm expectation doesn't lean forward. It doesn't rush. It doesn't keep asking questions. It feels like this is handled, even if the details aren't visible yet. Anxious expectation, on the other hand, is tense. It keeps checking, it keeps monitoring time, it keeps asking, is it happening yet? Both are technically expectation, but they come from completely different states. One stands, the other leans. And Neville was very clear about this. Even if people overlook it, you don't remain in the state by effort. You remain in it by naturalness. Naturalness is the real test. When something is assumed, it stops demanding attention. You don't need reminders. You don't need updates. You don't need reassurance. You don't keep asking about what already feels settled. This is why the question exposes everything. If you're asking it constantly, it's not because you're doing something wrong. It's because the state hasn't become normal yet. And here's the anchor you need to hear clearly. What's assumed doesn't ask for updates. And what keeps asking has already stepped into not yet. The moment something feels like part of your identity, you stop checking on it. Not because you're disciplined, but because there's nothing left to confirm. That's the difference between expectation and state. Expectation looks ahead. State lives here. And the more natural the state becomes, the quieter the question gets, until one day it doesn't arise at all, not because you silenced it, but because you no longer live as the one who needs to ask. That question doesn't come back because you forgot the law. It comes back because your nervous system gets activated. When pressure rises, when time passes, when something feels uncertain, the body reacts first, long before philosophy has a chance to speak. Tightness appears, breathing shortens, attention narrows, and then the mind does what it always does in that state. It asks for control. Is it working yet? That question is not a request for truth. It's a request for relief. Anxiety doesn't care what's true. It cares what feels safe. The not yet state is not impatience. It's a self trying to stay safe by staying alert. This is why so many people say the same thing in different words. I know this. I've seen it work. But I fall back. They're not lying. And they're not failing. They're regulating fear the only way they know how. When the nervous system feels threatened, it looks for certainty. It scans. It checks. It asks questions that promise immediate reassurance. The problem is, reassurance doesn't stabilize a state. It only soothes it temporarily. So the question comes back again, and again, and again. This is the emotional loop. Assume, feel calm, get triggered, ask the question, feel relief or disappointment, reset, and then people blame their belief. But belief was never the issue. Here's the reframe that changes everything. You're not doubting the law. You're regulating fear. And once you see that, you stop trying to argue with the question. You stop answering it, because you realize the solution isn't intellectual, it's positional. The anxiety doesn't need proof, it needs safety, and safety doesn't come from updates. It comes from returning to a settled place, even while the sensation is still present. That's why the loop keeps running. Not because you don't understand, but because your system learned to reach for the question whenever uncertainty appears. Seeing that clearly is the first step out of it. Here's where the confusion becomes dangerous. When the question shows up, is it working yet? The next thought almost always follows. Maybe I should stay out of not yet. More affirmations, more visualization, more effort to hold the state together. And this sounds responsible. It sounds disciplined. It even sounds spiritual. But most of the time it's the exact opposite of stabilization. Because what you reinforce from is what you train. If you repeat from calm, repetition can regulate. If you repeat from panic, repetition rehearses panic. This is the distinction almost no one makes. There is repetition that settles the system, and repetition that feeds the waiting self. Repetition born of steadiness is slow. It doesn't rush. It doesn't need to convince. It feels like returning home. Repetition born of anxiety is sharp, urgent, compulsive. It's not about assumption. It's about stopping the discomfort. And that's the trap. When you reinforce because you're afraid something slipped, you're not stabilizing the state. You're confirming the identity of someone who believes it can slip. So every affirmation becomes a check. Every visualization becomes surveillance. Every persistence becomes pressure. And pressure never creates settlement. This is why people feel exhausted by techniques they once loved. They're not using them to remain. They're using them to fix something they believe is broken. And that belief trains the waiting self. Here's the sentence that cuts through all of it. Reinforcing from panic trains the waiting self. Not because repetition is bad, but because the position behind it is. You don't need more effort when the question appears. You need less movement, less correcting, less proving. Stabilization doesn't come from doing more. It comes from stopping the reflex to repair. When the state is real, repetition feels optional. When the state is fragile, repetition feels necessary. And necessity is the signal. The moment you feel the urge to hold position, because you're afraid, that's not a cue to repeat harder. It's a cue to stop training the identity that's still waiting. Because the goal was never to reinforce belief. It was to become someone who doesn't need reinforcement to feel settled. Here's the shift that changes everything. That question, is it working yet, is not actually asking for an answer. It never was. It's asking for safety. It shows up when the system feels unsettled, when the body wants relief, when part of you wants to know it's okay to relax. And this is why answering the question never works. You can say, yes, it's working. You can remind yourself of past proof. You can remain for 10 minutes straight, and still the question comes back. Because the question wasn't intellectual, it was positional. It wasn't asking for information, it was asking for grounding. This is the moment most people miss. You don't respond to the question. You relocate yourself. You don't argue with it. You don't suppress it. You don't try to solve it. You notice it, and you change where you're standing. The question belongs to a self that is unsettled. So the only thing that dissolves it is settling the self. Not through force, not through reassurance, through position. When you return to steadiness, when you stop leaning forward, when you stop monitoring distance, the question loses its function. It has nothing left to do. This is why the solution always feels quieter than expected. There's no mental victory, no dramatic certainty, just a subtle shift back into yourself. And that's when you feel it. The urgency drops. The body softens. The mind stops scanning. Not because you answered the question, but because you're no longer the one who needs to ask it. This is the anchor to remember. The not yet state dissolves when the self stops leaning forward. Not when the future is solved, not when proof appears, but when you return to a position that doesn't need updates. And once you understand that, you stop chasing answers and start choosing where to stand. That's the real turn, from waiting to being. And from there, the question has nowhere left to live. This is where everything becomes usable, because knowing why the question appears is helpful, but knowing what to do when it appears is what changes the loop. So when that question shows up, is it working yet? You move through 3 simple steps. Not to fix the thought, not to correct yourself, but to exit the identity that's asking. Step 1. Recognize it for what it is. Say this internally, calmly. This is anxiety, not intuition. And anxiety always lives in not yet. That sentence matters, because intuition is quiet. It doesn't rush. It doesn't demand reassurance. Anxiety does, so you're not judging the question. You're naming the source. And the moment you name it correctly, it loses authority. Step 2. Do not respond mentally. This is where most people slip. They try to answer the question, they argue with it, they reassure it, they correct it. Don't. Every mental response keeps you inside the same identity. You don't win by answering better, you win by not playing. Let the question be there without engaging it. No explanation, no counterthought, no reinforcement, just non-participation. Step 3. Return to the body and the state. Feel your feet. Notice your breath. Relax your jaw. Lower your shoulders. Nothing dramatic. You're not trying to feel good. You're allowing yourself to feel present. This is the exit. You're not pushing the question away. You're stepping out of the position that generated it. And this is the sentence to remember when it happens. You don't answer the question. You exit the identity asking it. That's it. You just need to stop standing where that question makes sense. And every time you do this, even imperfectly, the loop weakens. Not because the question disappeared, but because you stopped living as the one who needs to ask it. When the question shows up, you don't explain, you don't fix, you don't convince. You return. Say this slowly, exactly as it is. This is anxiety, not a signal. Pause. I don't need to move toward the future. I need to stop stepping out of myself. That's it. No manifestation language. This is not to make something happen. It's to bring your system back. Use it every time the question appears. Not to stop the thought, but to stop living as the one who answers it. The repetition isn't for belief, it's for regulation. And regulation is what restores the state. There is another trap that keeps the loop alive. Even after you understand everything else, it sounds reasonable. It even sounds mature. When it works, I'll relax. When the money shows up, when the message arrives, when the proof appears, then I'll let my guard down. But this reverses the order. Because relaxation is not the reward, it's the position. Waiting for proof before you relax keeps you oriented toward absence. It keeps your nervous system on standby. It keeps the question alive in the background, and this is the line that exposes it. Waiting for proof is the reset. Every time you say, once I see it, I'll feel safe, you place safety in the future, and a future-based self can never settle. This doesn't mean you force calm, and it doesn't mean you pretend nothing matters. It means you stop postponing steadiness. Relaxation is not something you earn after manifestation. It's what allows the state to stabilize before it. The person who is waiting to relax is still the person who is waiting, and waiting always recreates the same posture. You don't relax because it worked. It works because you relaxed into a position that no longer needs constant updates. That's the inversion. The moment you stop saying, I'll relax when you step out of the loop, not because the future is solved, but because the self who was bracing is no longer running the show. And when the self relaxes first, the question loses its fuel. Not magically, mechanically. Because a settled system doesn't keep asking if it's okay to stand still. What actually ends this loop is not better thinking. It's identity. Not the identity you try to convince yourself of, but the one you recognize yourself as over time. So here is the self-concept that dissolves the question at the root. I am no longer someone who lives in not yet. I move when it's time, not when anxiety asks. Notice what that implies. But someone whose sense of self is not dependent on constant confirmation. This identity changes behavior automatically. You check less, not because you force discipline, but because the urge weakens. You feel less urgency, not because you suppress it, but because there's nothing to defend. You stop scanning for signs because you're no longer standing in the position of not yet. This is how self-concept actually works. You don't fight habits. They fall away when they stop matching who you are. Someone who feels secure doesn't need updates. They receive information when it's relevant and then return to themselves. And this is the sentence that matters most. Security kills the question, not proof, not time, not reassurance, security. When you feel internally safe, the question has no function. It doesn't get answered. It doesn't get suppressed. It simply doesn't arise, because the identity that needed it is no longer the one you're living as. And once this self-concept settles, everything else becomes easier. Less effort, less monitoring, less internal negotiation, not because you stopped caring, but because you stopped outsourcing safety to the future. This is the correction that lasts, not a better technique, a steadier self. And from that self, Movement happens quietly, without needing to ask if it's working. When the state stabilizes, people expect something dramatic to happen. A sign, a surge, a moment that proves everything's shifted. But that's not how movement usually shows up. It shows up as normality. Not excitement, not relief. Just a quiet sense that something feels easier than before. This is what Neville meant by the bridge of incidents. Not a miracle, not a leap, a sequence. And most of the time, you're already walking it before you realize anything changed. An idea crosses your mind that didn't feel available before. A conversation feels natural instead of forced. A decision that used to feel heavy suddenly feels obvious. Nothing flashy, nothing mystical, just motion. This is why so many people miss the bridge. They're waiting for something big while the movement arrives as something ordinary. And this sentence keeps you grounded. Most shifts feel boring while they're working. The bridge doesn't announce itself. It doesn't say, "This is it." It feels like you simply responded differently than you used to. You sent a message instead of overthinking it. You made a choice instead of postponing it. You followed an impulse without fear. That's movement. And it only becomes visible after the state has changed. From anxiety, you overlook these moments. From waiting, you dismiss them. From steadiness, you step into them naturally. This is why nothing needs to be forced. When you're no longer resetting yourself with the question, your attention opens. You notice options. You notice timing. You notice opportunities that were always there but didn't register before. The bridge doesn't carry you forward by effort. It appears where you're already standing once the inner position stops shifting backward. And when you stop expecting fireworks, life starts cooperating quietly. Not as a reward, as a reflection. That's the bridge. Real, ordinary, and already moving the moment you stop asking if it's working. Let's make this real with a few simple examples. Not dramatic ones. Normal life ones. Example 1. Money. A bill or expense comes up. The old response appears immediately. Is it working yet? Am I behind? Did I mess something up? The body tightens. The mind rushes. The urge to check, calculate, reinforce kicks in. The new state responds differently. The number is seen. The fact is acknowledged. But there's no identity collapse. Instead of asking if it's working, there's a pause, then a grounded action, a plan, a decision made without panic. Same situation, different position, and because the position changed, the experience changes with it. Example 2, a relationship or message. You send a text, you express interest, you put something out there. Time passes. The old question rises, is it working yet? Did I say the wrong thing? Should I check again? The waiting self takes over. Attention locks onto the phone. Meaning gets invented. The new state doesn't fight the urge, it just doesn't follow it. There's no need to update identity based on response time. You remain present, engaged in your life, not suspended in anticipation. And often the message comes through without the emotional charge it once carried. Not because you controlled the outcome, but because you stopped living as the one who waits. Example 3. A practical opportunity. An idea comes up. A side option. A small opening. The old pattern says, is this it? What if it doesn't work? Should I wait for something clearer? The question freezes movement. The new state responds simply. There's curiosity without urgency, action without pressure, participation without overthinking. You explore instead of evaluate. You move instead of monitor. And movement compounds. None of these examples involve force. None require perfect confidence. They all change at the same point. The moment the question stops being answered and the position changes instead. That's the difference. Same world, same circumstances. But the identity responding is no longer the one asking if it's working. And from that place, life starts moving again. Not loudly, but consistently. Listen when the question comes back. Now let this slow down. Nothing new needs to be understood here. Nothing needs to be solved. Nothing needs to be fixed. If the question is present right now, is it working yet? This is not a problem. This is not failure. This is not proof that you lost the state. It's simply a moment to return. So don't push the question away. Don't try to get rid of it. And don't turn it into a project. Just let it be there. And start with the first step. Notice the not yet. Notice the thought as a thought, not as a command, not as a warning. Just notice it. Notice how it appears. Notice where you feel it in the body. Maybe it's a tight chest, maybe it's a restless stomach, maybe it's a subtle leaning forward. You don't need to label it perfectly. You don't need to analyze it. Just notice. This moment of noticing is already a shift, because when you notice, you're no longer fused with the question. You're present with it, not inside it. Now the second step. Don't argue with it. This is the part that changes everything. You don't answer the question. You don't reassure it. You don't correct it. You don't say yes, you don't say no, you don't say trust the process. You let the question exist without participating in it. This may feel uncomfortable at first, because the habit is to respond, to manage, to secure the future. But notice something important. The question only has power when you engage it. The moment you stop answering, it loses its role. You're not ignoring it. You're not suppressing it. You're simply not standing there anymore. And now comes the third step. Return to position, return to the body, not to feel good, not to feel calm, just to feel here. Feel your feet on the ground, feel the weight of your body where you're sitting. Let the shoulders drop slightly. Unclench the jaw, soften the forehead. Nothing dramatic. You're not trying to change your mood. You're allowing your system to stop leaning forward. Return to the breath, not controlling it, just noticing it. The inhale, the exhale. Again. This is not meditation, this is regulation. And regulation is what stabilizes the state. Now repeat the cycle. Notice. The question might still be there. That's okay. Notice it again. Notice any remaining tension. Notice any urge to check, to think, to fix. No judgment. Don't answer. You don't owe the question anything. You don't need to explain why you're not answering. You don't need to justify it. You simply choose not to participate. Return. Return to presence. Return to the body. Return to now. Again. Notice. Don't answer. Return. Each time you do this, you are teaching your system something new. You're teaching it that safety does not come from updates, that steadiness does not come from proof, that you can remain yourself even while uncertainty exists. This is important. You are not waiting for the question to disappear before you return. You return with the question present. That's the difference. Because if you wait for it to disappear, you're still letting it lead. But when you return anyway, you take your position back. Over time, something subtle changes. The question starts to feel less urgent, less convincing, less necessary, not because you fought it, but because you stopped feeding it. And one day you'll notice something quietly surprising. The question still appears sometimes, but it doesn't pull you. It passes through without reorganizing your identity. That's when you know the state has stabilized, not because the world changed overnight, but because you stopped resetting yourself. So use this section as many times as you need. Listen to it when the pressure comes back, when the mind starts leaning forward, when the urge to check feels strong, not to escape reality, but to meet it without shrinking. Notice. Don't answer. Return. Again and again. This is not about manifesting faster. This is about staying where you are while life catches up. And when you stop leaving yourself, movement doesn't need to be forced. It happens quietly, naturally, in its own time. So whenever the question comes back, and it might, come back here. Notice. Don't answer. Return. That's enough. That's the practice. And from this place, you don't need to ask if it's working, because you're no longer living as the one who needs to know. So let's bring this together simply. It always starts with the same moment. The question appears. Is it working yet? That question isn't curiosity. It's the reset. Every time you ask it, you step back into waiting. You leave the position you were standing in. And the way out was never answering better. The way out was changing where you stand. You notice the question, you don't answer it, you return. Not to force calm, not to demand certainty, but to remain yourself while life is still unfolding. That's the exit. And this is the line to carry with you. The moment you leave not yet, movement begins. Not because the future suddenly rushes in, but because you stopped stepping out of the state that allows it to move. Before you go, answer this in the comments. Keep it simple. One sentence is enough. Where do you go when anxiety hits? Back to waiting or back to yourself? No explanations, just honesty. And when the question comes back, come back to this video. Not to learn something new, but to return. I'll see you in the comments.